No one thought it would turn into something this disturbing. At first, it was just a situation that didn't feel right. Nothing obvious, nothing that immediately raised alarms. But the deeper investigators looked, the more the pieces refused to fit. Small details started to surface. Inconsistencies, patterns, behaviors that didn't make sense on their own, but together painted something far darker. And then came the realization. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was something calculated, repeated, hidden behind normal life so well that no one had questioned it before. The person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. They were someone people trusted, and when the full picture finally came together, even experienced investigators were shaken by what they uncovered. At the beginning, the case didn't trigger immediate alarm. There was no dramatic crime scene, no obvious signs of forced entry or violence, just a situation that felt off, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed if not for one critical factor. Someone decided to report it. That decision changed everything. When investigators first stepped in, they approached it like any other sensitive case. Careful questioning, controlled environment, no assumptions. But as they started listening, really listening, the details began to shift. What seemed minor at first started to form a pattern. The timeline didn't quite add up. Certain interactions were repeated in ways that didn't feel natural. There were moments that suggested influence, someone guiding behavior, shaping responses, creating a version of events that didn't fully match reality. That's when the tone of the investigation changed, because experienced investigators know this feeling. It's not always about what's said, it's about what's missing, the pauses, the hesitation, the way certain details are avoided or altered. And in this case, those gaps were everywhere. As interviews continued, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. The situation wasn't isolated. It wasn't accidental. It had structure, which meant one thing. There was someone behind it, someone who understood how to stay unnoticed. The next step was to identify who had consistent access, who was present in the background of these interactions, who had the opportunity to influence without drawing attention. And that's where the case took a darker turn, because the name that kept coming up wasn't unfamiliar. It was someone within reach, someone connected to the environment, someone who had built enough trust to never be questioned in the first place. At first, investigators moved carefully. They couldn't risk alerting the individual too early. Cases like this depend heavily on timing. Acting too soon can shut everything down, while waiting too long can allow more harm. So they observed, battles were tracked. Interactions were monitored. Background information was quietly gathered. And the more they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't random behavior. It was deliberate. There were signs of planning. Repetition. Control. The individual had created a system that allowed them to operate without raising suspicion. They understood routines, knew when attention was low, and used that to their advantage. But perhaps the most disturbing part wasn't the method. It was how normal everything appeared on the surface. To others, this person didn't stand out. They fit in, spoke normally, acted appropriately. There was nothing obvious that would make someone stop and question their behavior, which is exactly why it went unnoticed for so long. As investigators built their case, they started connecting smaller pieces, details that had once seemed insignificant. A comment here, a pattern there, behavioral shifts that on their own didn't mean much, but together they revealed something much bigger. A pattern of behavior that had likely been developing over time. And that realization changed the urgency of everything. Because if it had been happening once, he could have been happening more than once. And if that was true, then there was a real possibility that this case was only part of a larger picture. At this stage, the investigation was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about proving it. And to do that, they needed something stronger than suspicion. They needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. So the strategy shifted again. Every interaction became critical. Every detail mattered. Investigators worked to build a timeline that was precise, consistent, and impossible to ignore. They knew that once they moved forward, there would be no turning back. And they also knew something else. The person they were watching had no idea how close they were to being exposed. Because for all the control they thought they had missed one thing. And that one detail was about to change everything. That one detail didn't arrive with a dramatic reveal. It surfaced quietly, almost overlooked at first, but once investigators saw it in context, everything shifted. It was the kind of evidence that didn't rely on interpretation. It didn't depend on memory or conflicting statements. It was consistent, verifiable. and impossible to ignore. From that point on, the investigation moved with precision. What had once been fragments, small observations, subtle inconsistencies, behavioral patterns, were now aligned into a clear, structured timeline. Every piece supported the next. Every gap that once created doubt was now filled with something concrete. And most importantly, the pattern held, the same behavior repeated, the same methods, the same controlled environment. It was no longer a question of if something had happened. It was a question of how long it had been happening, and how much had gone unnoticed. That realization added urgency, because cases like this aren't just about uncovering the truth. They're about stopping something that could still be ongoing. Investigators coordinated carefully. Timing mattered. They needed to ensure that when they acted, it would be decisive. No room for denial. No opportunity for the individual to manipulate the situation or distort what had already been established. When the moment came, it wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. The individual was confronted with the evidence, clear, direct, and supported by a timeline that couldn't be dismissed. And in that moment, the image they had maintained for so long began to fall apart, because the strength of their position had always depended on one thing: secrecy. And now that was gone. The arrest didn't just mark the end of the investigation. It marked the exposure of something that had been hidden behind familiarity, behind trust, behind the assumption that certain people don't need to be questioned. For those connected to the situation, the impact was immediate and deeply unsettling, not just because of what had happened, but because of who had been responsible. The idea that someone so close, so integrated into everyday life, could carry something like this without detection. It forces a difficult kind of awareness, one that lingers long after the case is closed. For investigators, it was a case that stayed with them, not because it was the most complex, but because it revealed how easily behavior can be masked when it's wrapped in normalcy, how patterns can exist in plain sight when no one is looking for them, and perhaps most importantly, how critical it is to take even the smallest concern seriously. Because this case didn't begin with overwhelming evidence. It began with something that didn't feel right, a detail that could have been ignored, a moment that could have been dismissed, but wasn't. And that decision made all the difference. In the end, the truth wasn't uncovered by chance. It was uncovered because someone paid attention and refused to look away. If this story made you realize how much can stay hidden behind normal life, how important it is to notice the details others ignore, then you're already thinking differently. Because the most disturbing cases aren't always the ones that look dangerous. They're the ones that don't. So if you want more real stories, deeper insights, and cases that reveal what's really happening beneath the surface, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be hiding in plain sight.